Chapter 1. Chains of Brass and Bone. The sky above the ash wastes was the color of old blood, murky, heavy, motionless. It pressed down on the world like a corpse blanket, the horizon lost to dust and heat shimmer. Nothing lived here that wasn't desperate. Nothing lasted that wasn't cruel. Through this choking, scorched desolation walked Grogmaw. Each step was thunder in the silence. His great boots kicked up plumes of gray ash, his massive frame wrapped in scorched hide and rusting chainmail, the scarred cleaver strapped across his back like a sleeping god. His breath came slow and steady, each exhale trailing mist despite the heat. His gut plate, etched with runes old and worn, throbbed with the sting of cracked metal and deeper aches beneath. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. He hadn't spoken in longer. On the 4th day, they came. They didn't ride beasts. They were beasts. A Chaos Dwarf warband, iron-bound and mounted on grotesque mechanical constructs, bull centaur mockeries with steam-belching flanks and barbed hooves. They emerged from a sandstorm like rusted spirits, their eyes hidden behind brass masks carved with snarling demons. The lead rider raised a hand. The engine spawn beneath him hissed and halted. The chains rattled. From behind them surged their tools, hobgoblins on leashes, dragging man-catchers, warp-steel hooks, and nets soaked in an anesthetic ichor. They were not here to kill. They were here to harvest. Grogmaw turned slowly. He didn't run. He never did. He stood tall, a mountain of meat and silence. The hobgoblins encircled. One lunged. The chain wrapped around Grogmaw's thigh like a snake, then snapped taut as he moved. One kick. Just one. The goblin shattered like a sack of bones, jaw torn loose, blood spraying across the dust in arcs. Another jabbed a spear into Grogmaw's ribs. He grabbed the shaft and pulled the goblin in, bit his throat out. But there were too many. Bolts thudded into his back, crackling with warp energy. Spiked nets tangled around his limbs, more chains. Hooks dug into his flesh, barbed, twisted, and hot with daemon-forged sigils. A whip of screaming iron lashed across his face, tearing a strip of skin from cheek to chin. He roared, not in pain, but fury. The sound shook the air, sent goblins scattering. Even the dwarfs paused. But it was not enough. The centaurs charged. Grogmaw struck one down with a slab of broken metal, but another rammed him from behind, its horned skull slamming into his spine with the force of a charging bull. He dropped to one knee, and the mask came down. A brass helm, fused with the flesh of 10,000 slaves, carved with a single rune, and pressed against his skull, and the world went black. He awoke in chains. Not iron, brass. Each link the width of a man's arm, carved with runes that squirmed when stared at. They bound his wrists, ankles, and throat. Each breath sent them glowing faintly, draining. The air was thick here, hot, oily, choking with sulfur and burnt blood. Grogmaw lay in a pit, a mine shaft 1/2 mile wide, dug deep into the skin of the world. Around him, ogres groaned and whimpered, their bodies mutilated by labor and war flesh. Some no longer had eyes. Some had too many. One wept black blood from the holes in its shoulders. The sky was gone. Only firelight now, and the endless scream of the forges. Above, gantries stretched like webs. Chaos Dwarfs marched across them in rust-colored robes, barking commands, cracking electric whips. Fire daemons howled within the walls, clawing to be freed. The scent of cooked soul clung to every stone. This was Shergrund, the bleeding pit, the gut of the Chaos Dwarf Empire. And it was here Grogmaw was broken, or so they thought. The other ogres stared at him with hollow eyes. Some whispered his name. Others didn't believe it was him. He was myth, a story told in pit shack and flame breath. The ogre who defied chaos, who walked alone. He met their eyes, then closed his own, and listened. He could hear it, beneath the screams and hammers, beneath the chains and laughter. The heartbeat of the mountain, slow, terrible, waiting. Grogmaw's fingers curled. Not broken. Not yet. The ash wastes had taken everything but one thing. And that one thing was the only thing that mattered now. Endurance. Chapter 2. The Furnace of Flesh. The days bled together in Zygrund. There was no sun, no moon. Only the glow, the eternal red light of molten metal, of warp flame furnaces that hissed and roared like caged gods. The forge chambers beat like hearts, echoing through the bones of the pit, making sleep a fevered lie. Grogmaw had no way of marking time, only the pain, the labor, and the screams. Every cycle, the ogres were chained to the tread lines, massive treadmills powered by their own muscle and misery. They turned gears that stoked the soul furnaces, pumped warp fire through runes, and drove the crucibles used to bind metal and demon. Each stumble meant the whip. Each hesitation meant the brand. Grogmaw bore both. His back was a lattice-work of fresh lash marks. His arms, scarred already from 100 battles, now bore sigils pressed into his skin with glowing irons, each one writhing when touched, whispering vile promises in tongues only madness understood. He did not cry out. He did not kneel. And he never begged. But the others did. There was Brosh, once a butcherkin of the Gutlord tribes, now half his size, ribs visible through sickened flesh. His left leg had fused with iron, not armor, growth. The metal grew from the bone like disease. He wept nightly for the children he once ate. There was Murg, a massive bull ogre who could crack rock with his fists, but who now gibbered and muttered to himself, staring at the ceiling where no sky existed. A daemon had kissed his tongue. It hadn't grown back. And Ugril, who simply stopped breathing one day mid-turn on the treadline. No one spoke when he collapsed. They just stepped over his body and kept walking. Being treated, they had no choice. Above them, the overseers watched. Chaos Dwarfs in brass masks and blood-red robes, riding platforms powered by screaming flame. Each carried a lash of liquid metal and a staff crowned with rune-skulled crows. But worst among them was Master Runebinder Draznach. His voice was like coal dragged across bone. His face, never seen, hid behind a steel mask with a single vertical slit, from which warp light leaked like green fog. It was Draznach who picked the strongest. The candidates. Ogres who showed defiance, or will, or too much strength. He had them hauled up in chains, dragged into the sanctum of joining, and none ever returned the same. Grogmaw saw the first one go, Scort, a pit fighter with 12 kills to his name. He spat at Draznach as they chained him. He came back, 2 days later, no longer Scort. His body had been stretched, distended with molten brass fused through his muscle. His jaw hung loose, replaced with a chain-fed grinder. His eyes bled green. His cleaver arm had been removed and replaced with a screaming, demonic piston. He attacked without command. Slaughtered 3 ogres before Grogmaw tackled him. It wasn't a fight. It was butchery. Scort wept as he died. What was left of him, anyway? And still the dwarfs watched, and noted, and smiled. Grogmaw knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him. And when they did, he didn't resist. 2 hobgoblins approached, one shift, flanked by a mechanical beast of brass and bone, its mouth a furnace, its legs spidered with serrated joints. They barked commands. Grogmaw didn't move. They jabbed him with a forked rod, and the pain seared through his nerves like lightning dipped in hatred. He stood, walked, silently. They took him downward, not up to the crucibles where the demon-bound were forged. Down, beneath the forges, beneath even the slave pens, to the vault of cinders. The air here was thick with soot and memory. The walls pulsed faintly, flesh and rock stitched together by ritual and rage. Runes flickered underfoot, and statues of forgotten Chaos Dwarf kings loomed from alcoves like frozen demons. In the center of the chamber was the altar. Not a slab, not a forge, but a well filled not with water but boiling metal and something darker. It whispered, it breathed. Beside it stood Drasnach. He spoke without turning. Strange thing, for an ogre to carry a mark and not kneel. Grogmaw said nothing. The runebinder turned. His mask leaked green mist in lazy tendrils. You burn, but not brightly, not like the others, not loyal, not broken, not clean. He stepped closer. I could make you beautiful, beast. I could show you eternity. You'd never walk alone again. A low growl built in Grogmaw's throat. But he didn't speak. Drasnach raised a hand. Flame gathered in his palm, not fire. Something older, something alive. Let me in, the dwarf hissed. And the flame lunged. It struck Grogmaw's chest, hammering into the mark left long ago. The eye, the spiral, the room screamed. The altar shook. The flame recoiled. Drasnach stumbled back, hissing. You are touched, he snarled. Tainted, yes, but not ours. Something else claims you. Grogmaw raised his head, blood running from his nose. He smiled. Just once, and then he spat into the demon well. It hissed, boiled, cried out like a child burned alive, and the runebinder struck him down with a word of ash and lightning. They found Grogmaw days later, dumped in the slag heap, barely breathing. The other ogres watched as he crawled out, skin flayed, chains fused to his back, hair scorched to black dust. But he stood, and when one of them knelt beside him and whispered, "Why did you return?" Grogmaw rasped through cracked lips, and never left, and the chain around his neck snapped. Chapter 3. The Butcher Machine. They brought it in on iron rails soaked with blood. The chains groaned long before the creature howled. The air in the lower pits of Zargren thickened as if it knew something unnatural was being born beneath the stone. The forge tunnel trembled. The walls, carved with binding runes and daemon names, sweated molten resin. Heat spilled into the slave quarters like a fever. Even the overseers stepped back. And when the gate cracked open, just a sliver at first, the scream that spilled out wasn't from lungs. It came from engines. They called it Project K-Theta. But the ogres whispered another name. The Butcher Machine. It was taller than a troll, broader than a war elephant, its flesh fused with black iron plates, each hammered in with bolts the size of spears. Its face had no eyes, only a furnace-like maw that glowed with internal fire. Where its right arm should have been was a cleaver, forged from a demon's bone and riveted directly into muscle and tendon. Its left arm had mutated beyond recognition, swollen and twisted with warp veins, fingers grown into hooks, chains, and blades, and from its back, dozens of spines jutted out like stakes, each one crowned with a skull, some still fresh and dripping. It moved like it remembered pain. The slaves were forced to watch, forced to kneel as Drasnach recited the binding rites. Grogmaw was among them, one eye still sealed shut from the lashings he'd taken in the vault of cinders. His breathing was slow, measured. He did not kneel. Means the hobgoblins saw. They moved toward him, snarling, whips drawn, but they never reached him, because that was when the butcher machine broke its chains. There was no warning, no ritual failure, no chaos surge. It simply decided. It twisted its torso with a grinding shriek, wrenched free of the crucible platform, and charged. The first Chaos Dwarf it reached didn't even scream, just vanished in a blossom of gore, crushed beneath a steel-plated hoof. A hobgoblin tried to run, but the cleaver arm sliced him in half. The blade so hot it cauterized the top half of his body while the lower half walked another 2 steps before collapsing. Grogmaw stood, still, silent, and watched. The butcher machine tore through the slave ranks, not out of hunger or rage, but because that's what it had been made for. His daemon core sang with each kill. Warp light bled from its mouth as it bellowed, a sound like molten steel poured into screaming lungs. Murg tried to fight it. The mad bull ogre lunged with a mining pick, striking the monster in the side. The pick shattered. Murg didn't. But what was left of him wasn't Murg anymore. The butcher machine picked him up by the leg and swung him like a flail, pulping 3 others before hurling what remained into a forge chimney. That was when Grogmaw moved. He picked up a length of rebar from the ground, bent and jagged like a spear chewed by gods, and walked toward the beast. No roar, no speech, only purpose. The butcher machine turned. It recognized him. The islets of its furnace face narrowed, and then it charged. Grogmaw, he met it head-on. The cleaver came first, a sideways sweep that would have cut a wyvern in 2. Grogmaw ducked low, the heat searing his scalp. He drove the rebar forward, straight into the exposed piping beneath its chestplate. The rebar snapped. The butcher roared. Its mutated left arm lashed out, chains wrapping around Grogmaw's torso, pulling. Grogmaw let it. He grabbed the chains, hauled himself forward, and head-butted the thing square in the chest. Metal groaned. He slammed his fists into the vents on its sides. Once, twice, sparks flew. The cleaver came down again. It bit deep into Grogmaw's shoulder. The flesh split. Not a clean cut, but a messy gash that poured blood like tar. Grogmaw roared in pain, teeth bared, but his hands did not stop moving. He tore one of the chains free, wrapped it around his arm, and swung it like a flail, smashing the beast's furnace face. The mask cracked. Behind it, an eye. Not human, not ogre, not dwarf, but something alive. Something bound. He looked at him, and he saw himself, not in body, but in fate. A creature made to kill, built for chains, bound by others, used, forgotten. Grogmaw grabbed its skull and pulled. With both hands he ripped. The plating peeled back with a squeal of metal. The creature thrashed. Its cleaver drove into his thigh, deeper this time. Bone cracked. Grogmaw didn't care. He shoved his hand into the exposed cavity and felt it. The rune heart. A chunk of warpstone suspended in molten brass, etched with living glyphs that writhed like maggots. He crushed it. The world shook. The butcher machine screamed. Its cleaver dropped. Flames erupted from its mouth. The chains spasmed. Its body locked up, then exploded in a wave of pressure and fire. Grogmaw was thrown backwards, body crashing into slag, his flesh burning, bones splintering. Then, silence. Only the crackle of fire. Only the smell of cooked flesh. The other ogres began to crawl forward, not to fight, not to flee. But when did I think about time to look at him? His body lay broken, bleeding, but alive. He opened one eye. spat blood, and smiled. And in that moment a whisper passed between the survivors. "He's one of us. No, he's more." And in the pits of Zagrant, something began. A feeling that had not existed in centuries. Not fear, not hate, not hunger. Hope. Chapter 4. The Ashborn. They began to gather around the fire pits at night. Not for warmth. There was no warmth left in Zargund. Only heat, dry, dead, hateful, the kind of heat that peeled skin from bone and turned breath to dust. No. The ogres gathered for something older than comfort. They gathered for Grogmaw. He sat at the edge of the slag crater where the butcher machine had died, its twisted remains still smoldering. Bits of its blackened shell jutted from the earth like the bones of a titan, glowing faintly with rune light. At the center, the earth was scorched glass, where the rune heart had cracked the stone. Grogmaw sat in silence, his right leg splinted with scrap iron, his shoulder crudely stitched by fire-hardened bone needles. Every breath hurt, every blink bled, but he was alive, and the others came, one by one, two by two, until the pit was full of giants, too broken to stand tall, too furious to die. They limped, crawled, dragged twisted limbs behind them, but their eyes had changed. No longer hollow, no longer vacant. They looked at him like they were looking up for the first time. There was Brosh, gaunt but standing, warp metal still growing through his ribs. Murg's brother, a scar-faced brute named Dren, missing half his jaw but still strong. And Wurg, who had once led a failed rebellion a decade past and still bore the scar brands of every pitmaster in Zarun. Borgut was the first to speak. His voice was a gravel avalanche, broken, unapologetic. "You killed their machine, their god chain. That makes you more than one of us." Grogmaw didn't answer. He hadn't spoken since the fight. His throat was raw, his mind still ringing from the pressure of that demon eye, but his silence had weight now. It wasn't retreat. His choice. Urgut stepped closer, dragging a rusted cleaver twice the length of a dwarf. The blade was dull, black with blood, but carried like a scepter. They branded us, fed us warpstone, made us into beasts. But now, they fear us again. And fear is the root of power. He stabbed the cleaver into the ground. "You lead us, out of this pit, through the fire. You are the Ashborn's flame." The name echoed. Ashborn. It began as a murmur, then a whisper, then a chant, low and guttural. "Ashborn, Ashborn, Ashborn." Some slammed their fists to their chests. Others howled to the burning sky. A few wept. But not Grogmaw. He simply stood. Slowly, grimacing, blood seeping from reopened wounds. He limped to the edge of the crater, overlooking the slag floor that had become their shrine. He looked at them. His kin, his curse, his mirror, and raised one hand, not high, just far enough. It was enough. That night, 3 more pit overseers were found dead. No blood. Only crushed skulls and shattered arms. The Ashborn left their corpses in a circle around the slave barracks. Message sent. The next morning, Drasnak unleashed the flamehounds. Warp-mutated beasts, stitched from hound, demon, and forge ember. They moved like fire and shadow, trailing ash and molten drool. The overseers set them loose in the barracks at dawn. They expected panic. What they found was war. The first hound lunged for Brosh, and Brosh caught it. The beast's jaws sank into his forearm, but the ogre didn't scream. He slammed it into a wall 3 times, then ripped its jaw off and bit through its neck. Black flame spewed from the wound, but Brosh didn't let go. Others followed. Ashborn piled onto the hounds with chains, rocks, broken tools. One hound exploded in a pulse of warp fire. 3 ogres died screaming, but more took their place. And at the center, Grogmaw moved like the end of a siege. He fought with no weapon, only his fists. One strike crushed a hound's spine. Another broke the floor beneath it. He tore the brass helm from an overseer's face and used it to beat another to death. The forge corridor ran red, and when it was done, 13 ogres were dead. But 6 hounds lay still, and the overseers had fled. They burned the corpses that night. Allotted waste. In ritual, the Ashborns stacked them on a pyre of broken chains and smelted crates, oiling them with demon-forged grease stolen from the vats. The flames rose high, too high. They licked the cavern ceiling. They cast dancing shadows that looked like gods in mourning. Grogmaw stood at the edge, and this time he spoke. His voice was rough, scarred, a stone dragged across a battlefield. Not slaves. The ogres fell silent. Not monsters. They leaned in. Ashborn. He pointed toward the deeper tunnels, uncharted, unguarded, for tomorrow. We go down. They whispered. Down. Wurgit nodded. The lower crucibles. The demon cages. The forgotten forges. Grogmaw looked at the fire, the smoke rising like a second mountain. There's something down there, he growled. Something they don't want us to see. And he added, quieter. Something they fear. That night, Draznach watched from the forge spire. The Ashborn danced around flame, unbroken, unafraid. He clenched his gauntlet until his palm bled, and whispered to the shadows behind him. Release the bindings, wake the crucible. The shadows shifted, and a voice like wet iron replied, The ogre walks toward his fire. Let him burn. But deep below, in the black stone veins beneath the Zargrunt, something else began to stir. The heart of metal, her voice with no name. Waiting, watching, ready, and for the first time in centuries, the mountain knew fear. Chapter 5. Hunger Unbound. The tunnels beneath Zargrund were not made by mortal hands. They were carved by will, by ritual, and by fire. Black stone fused with daemon bone lined the walls. Runes pulsed faintly in the dark, glowing red like blood through skin. Some whispered, others wept. The deeper the Ashborn pushed, the hotter it grew, not with flame, but with presence. The kind that made skin itch and thoughts crawl sideways. Grogmaw led them in silence. His body was wrapped in chains scavenged from the mines, not for restraint, but armor. Every loop bore a different kill, a different break. His cleaver was gone, left behind after the butcher machine fight. Now he carried a forge hammer the size of a dwarf's coffin, its head cracked but still screaming heat. Behind him followed 21 ogres. The Ashborn, twisted, scarred, free. Brosh limped with a metal growth pushing from his spine. Wirgu muttered to himself, blade strapped to each forearm, eyes too wide, too knowing. Others bore pieces of forged machinery as weapons, axles, chains, engine parts turned into instruments of war. They walked for hours, maybe days, time bent here. They passed old altars, not to the Chaos gods, but to something older, the maw, the hunger, the thing with no name that still eats. Ogre runes, but wrong, distorted by exposure, fused with chaos glyphs. The mouths carved into the stone walls were too wide, too deep. Some still dripped with blood. Fresh. They were close. Too close. Grogmaw raised a hand. He stopped. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a massive chamber. Its ceiling stretched beyond sight, lost in shadow. In the center stood a spire of flesh and metal, an altar twisted into a throne, its base built from ogre skulls. At its top, suspended by chains, was an ogre. Still breathing, still alive. Warpstone veins ran through his body like vines through rotted trees. His eyes glowed green, his mouth twitched. Every now and then he'd convulse, as though something inside him laughed. "Oh, is that?" Brosh whispered. Wood hissed. "That's no ogre anymore." And it wasn't. It was a flesh puppet, a creature strung between mutation and misery, a warning made flesh. Above him, runes shimmered, cycling between ogre, dark tongue, and something beneath speech. Grogmaw stepped forward. The puppet's eyes locked with his. "You smell familiar," it rasped. "Where's the crucible?" Grogmaw asked. The creature laughed. "Inside me, around me. I am it." Its jaw cracked, split wider, revealing metal teeth fused with bone. Warp energy pulsed through its chest, casting shadows that didn't match its shape. "You came to break chains, giant?" Grogmaw tightened his grip on the hammer. "I came to end them." The puppet shrieked, and the crucible awoke. The walls opened, not with doors, but with bodies. Ogre-shaped horrors stepped from the stone, fused with steel, their eyes blind, mouths sealed with rune wax. Their limbs were axes, drills, claws. Once Ashborn, now bound. 12 demon-bound ogres, each dripping with filth, each exhaling smoke. The Ashborn hesitated. Then the screaming began. The first bound tore through Dren, ripping his arm off at the socket and hurling it into Brosh's face. Another pounced on Word, claws raking down his chest. He roared and stabbed up with both blades, splitting the thing's throat. But it didn't die. It just giggled, even as its jaw dangled. Brosh tackled one, and was impaled through the gut by a bone drill. Grogmaw charged. The hammer swung. It crushed one bound ogre's head, bone, steel, rune, all flattened in a single strike. The impact cracked the floor. Sparks flew. Teeth scattered like seeds. Another lunged. Grogmaw ducked low, rolled under a sweeping cleaver arm, and ripped the warpstone core from its ribcage. It exploded. Ashborn screamed. Limbs flew. Blood steamed. The air was poison now. Urgot bled from both eyes, but still fought. He climbed one bound's back, stabbing into its neck again and again until its spine cracked. When it fell, it crushed him. He didn't rise. Rosh, bleeding, pulled the drill from his belly and drove it into his attacker's eye. One final act. Then he too was still. Only 3 Ashborn remained. Then 2. Then none. Only Grogmaw. His skin seared. His hammer melted down to the... He faced the final bound. Twice his size. 4 arms. 1 mouth. No soul. Grogmaw dropped the hammer, raised his fists, and charged. The creature swung. Grogmaw ducked, rammed his shoulder into its gut, drove it back into the spire, and grabbed hold of its fused spine. With a scream of blood and fire, he ripped it out. The bound twitched. Her lips collapsed. Silence returned. Grogmaw stood, covered in ash. Alone. He limped to the throne. The flesh puppet laughed weakly. "You broke them. You'll never break me." Grogmaw leaned close. "You already broke yourself." And he bit through its throat. Warp blood sprayed. Runes flared. The chamber shuddered. The crucible died. And Grogmaw fell to his knees. When he rose, the ash had settled. The chamber stank of death, of freedom. He was alone, but he had won. Behind him, the corpses of the Ashborn burned. Their bones fed the fire, and the whispers in the walls faded. But not entirely, because something deeper now whispered to him. Not chaos, nor gods, but the echo of kin, those who died for more, and for the first time since Dregmath, since Screaming Hill, since the Black Cross. Grogmaw wept. No words, no sound, just blood, and ash, and memory. Chapter 6. Smoke over Zargrund. They rose from the pits in silence. No banners, no drums, no war cries. Just Grogmaw and what remained of the Ashborn. 6 survivors. Not unscarred, not whole, but changed. Each bore the marks of the crucible. Some had eyes that shimmered faintly green, others trembled in silence, hearing whispers no one else could. Their armor was scavenged from the dead, shard plates from bound ogres, chainmail fused with meat, rusted helm fragments hammered into place with blood and desperation. The way back up was slick with heat. The smoke stung their eyes, mixed with the scent of flesh metal still smoldering in the tunnels below. But they didn't falter. Zargrund awaited above. The slaves didn't notice at first, too used to pain, too dulled by repetition, but word traveled like fire under oil. Grogmaw returned. The crucible is broken. The bound are dead. By the time they reached the mid-furnace platforms, hundreds of ogres had stopped their treadmills. Chains hung limp. Overseers began to bark orders until they saw the faces of those who walked behind Grogmaw. And the thing that hung from his shoulder, a rune heart, twice the size of a man's skull, still pulsing, still dripping diamond ichor, still beating. He hurled it onto the forge floor. It cracked a tile, bounced once, and rolled into the embers. The forge screamed, and then silence. The ogres turned, and the first cries of rebellion rang out. The siege of Zargrund did not begin with a charge. It began with abandonment. Thousands of ogres, chained for centuries, snapped their manacles on anvils. They stormed the food pits, the water towers, the weapon cages. They overran the hobgoblin kennels in a tide of rage and hunger. For the first time in memory, the pitmasters fled. The overseers responded the only way they knew, with fire. From the upper walls, flame cannons howled. Warp-ignited oil burst across the platforms, searing fat from bone, turning ogres into burning shadows. Others were crushed beneath rune-powered lifts dropped from above. Entire sections of the mines collapsed under quake spells triggered by panicked dwarf engineers. The Ashborn held the center. Grogmaw did not give orders. He simply stood, atop a ruined forge wheel, cleaver reclaimed. Gut plate, scorched but still intact. Eyes fixed on the fortress above. Behind him dozens now gathered, not soldiers, but believers. A brute named Irk dragged an overseer's head behind him like a pet. A twin-born pair who never spoke fought, back to back, with nothing but forge tongs and broken axes. Even Brosh, his arm now fully warped into a brass claw, stood with the living. The dwarfs sent the bull centaurs. They came from the upper chambers in a stampede of hoof and brass. Their eyes were slits of molten hate. Their axes were cursed with demonic syllables, each edge screaming as it cut. They plowed through the outer ring of ogres like threshers through wheat. Blood sprayed in arcs. Skulls cracked under hoof. A twin-born died, cleaved in two. Another Ashborn screamed as his jaw was torn free and eaten by the bull who struck him. The line wavered. Grogmaw leapt down from the forge wheel. His roar split the sky. He met the first bull centaur in a sprint, shoulder first, smashing it backward into a column. The creature slashed with its axe. Grogmaw caught it with the cleaver, parried, and smashed the centaur's snout flat with a headbutt. He didn't stop. He ripped a hook from a nearby winch, lashed it to a chain, and used it to drag a second centaur to the ground, then stomped on its throat until the metal snapped inward like cracked pottery. Still they came. 3 surrounded him. Axes swung. One caught his side, splitting chainmail and biting deep. He bit back. Literally, he sank his teeth into one centaur's throat and ripped it out, spitting blood and gristle as the beast thrashed and died. The remaining 2 tried to flee. They didn't make it 10 steps before Urk crushed one under a furnace door, and Brosh pulverized the other with his brass claw, caving its skull like wet clay. The line held, and the ogres roared. The smoke of war curled toward the high ziggurat of the Overlord's keep. Draznach watched from its apex. His eyes, hidden behind black glass lenses, twitched. "Bring it down," he hissed. The engineers at his feet hesitated. Would destroy the midforge. I said, "Bring it down." A rune was pressed. Deep beneath the pits, the soul furnaces cracked. A chain of explosions thundered up through the foundation. The center of Jagrund collapsed. Dozens of ogres vanished into a screaming crater of fire and stone. Lava burst from the furnace wells, steam hissed. The ziggurat shuddered. But Grogmaw stood firm. The blast hurled him backwards. His skin blistered. His cleaver was torn from his grip. He struck the ground hard enough to crack stone. But he rose. Spoke in his lungs, blood in his eyes. And still, he rose. Behind him, the survivors rallied. Dozens now, maybe hundreds. The Ashborn, no longer a name. Now a nation. Grogmaw pointed toward the keep. No words. Just war. The ogres charged, and Jagrun began to burn from within. Chapter 7. The Maw of the Mountain. The fires of Zargrun still choked the sky as Grogmaw and what remained of the Ashborn turned their backs to the slaughter. They did not linger for victory. No songs were sung, no war trophies raised. What they left behind were ruins, smoking pits of torn metal and bone, a fortress drowned in its own greed and flame. The ogres marched into the ashwinds, upward, into the mountains that loomed like jagged gods watching in silence. Mount Druxjul, a place so ancient the Chaos Dwarfs had forgotten it once feared. Older than their runes, older than the forges, older than chains. The path was narrow, carved by quake and time. Along the cliff faces, statues watched them pass, hulking forms of ogre gods not worshipped in centuries. Each had their jaws open wide, teeth cracked, tongues forked. The stone was black with the blood of old rites. The Ashborn climbed, one by one. In silence, Rog limped, his metal growths pulsing faintly green, the infection now deeper than marrow. Urk was missing an eye, his belly split and stitched with chain. Others bore burns, crushed fingers, severed ears. They followed Grogmaw, not out of loyalty, but because he hadn't broken yet. Not in the crucible, not in the pit, but in fire. At the summit, the earth opened. A crater, wide as a fortress, yawned before them. It pulsed with heat, but not fire. Something else, something deeper. Runes, long erased, still shimmered in the cracks. Bones littered the path, some ogre, some not. Some still twitched. In the center stood the altar. Built from basalt, metal, and ancient bone, it resembled a monstrous jaw split open to receive the sky. At its base were offerings, war trophies, dismembered limbs, half-eaten hearts. Everything stank of hunger. This was a temple to the great Maw, but something was wrong. It was too still. The air didn't move. The clouds refused to shift. Even the wind, so fierce on the climb, died here. The world held its breath. The ogres gathered. Curious. Vorgot stepped forward, eyes glassy. "We hear," he rasped. "The mouth, the voice, it waits." He knelt before the altar and began to pray. It wasn't language, it was devotion. A deep, chesty chant, a dirge spoken through clotted blood and cracked teeth. Others followed. Some knelt, some wept. One by one they began to offer. A severed hand, a gnawed bone, their own flesh. A blade was passed. Ogres drew it across their chests, arms, bellies, feeding the stone with steaming blood. Grogmaw stood apart, watching, silent. Rosh turned to him. "You won't kneel?" Grogmaw shook his head. "This more. It's not the one we knew." And then the altar moved. Not a tremor, a shift. The earth cracked, and a mouth opened beneath it, wider than a house, ringed with yellow stone, teeth slick with old gore. From it came a voice, not sound, but feeling, a pressure behind the eyes, a whisper inside the marrow. "Feel," Argo screamed, not in fear, but ecstasy. They threw themselves forward, into the mouth, into the dark. 3, 5, 9, gone. One by one they were swallowed whole. The altar's jaw snapped shut behind each. Grogmaw took a step forward. The air around him ached. It called to him, not with rage, just with belonging. "End your hunger," it whispered. "Let me make you whole." He saw a vision. Himself, bloated and mighty, seated on a throne of bones, crowned with fire. The world fed to him piece by piece. Men, dwarfs, elves, all screaming as they slid down a throat the size of a canyon. His, the Maw's, both. But when he opened his eyes, he saw Vorgot, laughing as he plunged a blade into his own gut and offered his intestines to the altar. He saw Urk, kneeling, crying, holding a child ogre's skull like a relic. He saw the madness, the lie. "Stop," Grogmaw growled. No one heard. They only screamed louder. Another ogre hurled himself into the pit. Grogmaw moved. He charged Vorgot, slamming into him with a roar that cracked stone. The old fanatic went down howling, spitting blood. The other ogres turned, confused, dazed. He grabbed Urk by the collar and dragged him away from the edge. "Look," he snarled. "Look at what it makes you—" The mountain shook. The altar screamed, no longer a whisper, but anger. Betrayal. Grogmaw turned to the pit and lifted his cleaver and smashed the stone teeth with one brutal strike. This cracked. The ground wailed. He struck again, and again. The jaw split down the middle. Magma gushed from the wound. A scream louder than thunder burst from the crater, a sound so massive it felt like the mountain would die. The mouth closed, half shattered. The vision was gone. The ogres staggered back. Only half remained. Those who had leapt were gone. Irk fell to his knees. What have we done?" Grogmaw didn't answer. He turned away from the altar, his eyes wet, not from sorrow, but from the truth. "This was never salvation," he said, "only another chain." Behind him, the mountain groaned. The Maw slept once more. But it remembered him, and it hungered. Chapter 8. The Brandless. The air at the foot of Mount Drakzul was different. Gone was the stench of slag and sulfur that clung to Zargrand like a second skin. Gone, too, the ever-present roar of the forges and the choking smoke of demon machinery. Here the wind was thin, dry, sharp as bone dust, whistling across the highland stone like a whisper carved by knives. Grogmaw and what remained of the Ashborn descended in silence. They moved as survivors, not conquerors. Scarred, hunched, their numbers halved, some limped, others bore blackened skin where altar fire had licked too close. They did not speak of the maw, not of the voices, not of the ones who jumped. Dirk followed behind Grogmaw with lowered eyes, the child skull still tied to his belt. Brosh walked slower each day, his metal-grawn arms stiff, weeping pus and rune ink. The mountain behind them had tried to eat them. And still the world ahead looked no kinder. They came to a valley cut by lightning. Black stone cliffs, jagged and raw, boxed them in on either side. Bones littered the trail, mostly ogre, some too warped to name. The rocks bore claw marks. Not beast, not blade. The scent hit them first. Old and wet, thick with infection, and something underneath. Something burned. Then came the sound. Not a boorhor. I drugged. His chains. Dragged. Not one. The ogres formed ranks. What weapons they had left, cleavers, forge hammers, splintered spears, were lifted. Grogmaw stood at their head. One eye narrowed. His cleaver rested across his shoulder like a tombstone that hadn't dropped yet. From the shadows came the Brandless. At first they looked like ogres. Twisted, yes, but ogres. Then the details unraveled. Their bodies were swollen with scar tissue, muscle warped with self-inflicted mutations. Runes once burned into their skin had been ripped out, taking chunks of meat with them. Some had gaping holes in their chests. Others bore lash scars layered 10 deep. One had no jaw, just a gaping maw sewn shut with brass wire. No armor, no masters. No chains, only the remnants of chains, dragged behind them as relics. And at the center, he came. Tall, even by ogre standards, his skin ashen, marked with thousands of tiny carvings, runes etched into flesh and then crossed out. His left hand was missing, replaced by a rusted hammerhead bolted directly into the wrist. His right eye had been gouged and filled with molten brass. He did not smile. He only watched, until he spoke, voice like grinding metal under ice. "So," he said, "the one with the burning eyes walks among us." Grogmaw did right. "I am Wurga twice damned," the leader said, "once by the Chaos Dwarfs, again by the Maw, and now by everything else." He lifted his hammer arm. A low chant rose from his followers. "You left your chains in the pit," Wurgot said, stepping forward. "We ripped ours out with our teeth. You wear your pain like a crown. But we bled for freedom. Not fame, not prophecy." One of the Ashborn stepped forward, Girk shaking, eyes wild. You should join us," he said. "We fight the same enemy." "No," Wurgot growled. "You serve another. His name is Grogmaw." He pointed his hammer. "He describes a wild horse, like a Starkia king. He asks me, does he walk? Hawk like a king, talks like a storm, carries the weight of the dead behind his back." Another Brandless ogre snarled. "We saw the fire," he hissed. "We heard the maw. We heard it call you." Grogmaw stepped forward. "No banners," he said. "No gods, no thrones. You speak like a prophet. I speak like a soldier." Wurgot's eye twitched. "You're a lie." He swung his hammer down into the dirt. Sparks erupted. Blood hissed from the cracks. "We survive by teeth, not by words. If you want to lead free ogres, you fight, Not with daemons, not with destiny, but with flesh. The circle widened. No one moved. Grogmaw nodded once. So be it. He stepped into the ring. The duel was not elegant. It was brutal. Wurgut came first, faster than his bulk allowed, his hammer sweeping low in a blur of rust and shrieking wind. Grogmaw dodged sideways, the impact shattering stone where he stood. Shards flew, blood welled from his shoulder. Too slow. He countered with a hook to the ribs. Bone cracked. Wurgut laughed. He swung again. This time it caught Grogmaw across the face, split his cheek open to the bone. Blood sprayed. The Ashborn cried out, the Brandless howled with savage glee. Grogmaw staggered, but didn't fall. He drove forward, shoulder past, slamming Wurgut into the cliff wall, fist after fist after fist, into the gut, the ribs, the throat. The air shook with each hit. Wurgut spat a tooth, then head-butted Grogmaw so hard his nose split. The two giants grappled. Flesh tore. Teeth snapped. The hammer struck again, into Grogmaw's thigh. He dropped to one knee. Wurgut raised the hammer for the killing blow, and Grogmaw caught it, with both hands, and snapped it in half. Then he grabbed Wurgut by the back of the neck, pulled him close, and whispered, "No chains," and drove his forehead into Wurgut's face. Once, twice, a third time. The sound was wet, final. Wurgut dropped. Not dead, but beaten, his face a ruin. The Brandless stood in silence. Grogmaw turned, blood dripping from his face, one arm limp, one eye swollen shut. "No kings," he said, "not even me." He looked down at Wurgut. "You live, because others need to see. There's a third way. Not kneel, not devour, but endure." The silence held. And then, slowly, one by one, the Brandless dropped their chains. Let them fall, and followed. The ogres of the pit, the ogres of the maw, the ogres of nothing, now walked together, toward war. Chapter 9. The Iron Descent. The mouth of the old underforge was a wound in the earth, a blackened fissure yawning open between two broken spires of slag-covered stone, half buried in scree and the bones of beasts that never made it back out. The air pouring from the gap was hot, but not like fire. It was the heat of machines left too long in torment, a damp, choking reek of grease and burned flesh. This was the way to the binding crucible, the heart of the Chaos Dwarfs' foul craft. The place where ogres had been turned into monsters, where flesh met metal not by choice but by ritual, where pain was melted and recast like iron. This was the place where freedom had been murdered. Grogmaw led the way. The Ashborn followed, silent, some limping, others dragging scavenged weapons, the Brandless now interspersed among them like shadow kin, too stubborn to die and too mad to fear. Brosh wheezed, his claw arm pulsing with a fevered glow. Urk carried 3 war banners bound into a pike, dragging behind him like the tails of a fallen comet. None of them spoke. They descended. The tunnel narrowed quickly, its walls carved with screaming faces, literal impressions of slaves who had been pressed into the rock by spell and steel. Their eyes bulged eternally, their mouths stretched open in endless agony. Some moved, some wept dust. The deeper they went, the more the earth groaned. Pipes jutted from walls like diseased veins, some leaking molten ichor, others filled with grinding teeth that turned endlessly with no purpose. Every step echoed. They passed corpses, half Mailer, half Ogre, fused to walls like forgotten warnings. Some had mouths welded shut, others still chanted softly, begging to be ended. One tried to rise when Grogmaw passed. He crushed it with a single step. No hesitation. No mercy. This place was beyond forgiveness. Then they reached the chamber. The binding crucible is not a forge. It was a temple. A wide circular space with a domed ceiling high above, stained black with centuries of soot and demonic runes. In the center, the crucible itself, a vast sunken basin filled with molten brass and cursed ore, churning with souls, yes, souls. You could see them, faces in the molten glow, writhing, screaming, clawing at nothing. Suspended above the crucible by chain and hook was an ogre, still breathing, barely. His limbs had been stretched, arms bolted in place. His torso was flayed open, exposing black muscle and a chest cavity filled with gears that spun with each ragged breath. His mouth was torn into a permanent grin, stitched back with gold wire. One eye blinked. The other was gone. In its place, a rune burned. Grogmaw stepped forward. The thing groaned. A voice like boiling tar. "You came too late." "What is this place?" Brosh whispered. The machine ogre laughed. "This is the blueprint. You think they only made soldiers? No, they made templates. One body to teach the next how to break." Grogmaw stared at it. "Your name?" The grin didn't move. But something beneath it cracked. "I was Grulge. First of the bound, first to scream and not stop." The chains above creaked. The crucible glowed hotter. "They'll come now," Grulge said. "You've made too much noise. They hear you." Then the runes on the floor lit up, and the guardians came. Doors opened in the walls, doors made of bone and rune-etched iron. From them the forge terrors lumbered out. 10 feet tall, four-armed, no faces. Their heads were sealed furnaces. Their hands were drills, cleavers, meat hooks, and rune bands. Their bodies were ogre flesh, once, now sculpted into killing machines, fused with demon spirits too angry to fade. They moved in silence. And then they charged. The chamber erupted into chaos. The first forge terror struck like a siege ram, hammering into Urk's flank and sending him sprawling. He screamed as it lifted a cleaver to gut him, but Brosh dove in, his claw arm snapping shut on the terror's wrist and ripping it free. Black ichor sprayed. Another came for Grogmaw. He sidestepped, barely, the spinning drill screaming past his ear, and drove his cleaver into the monster's side. Sparks burst. It didn't scream. It didn't even react. It just turned and punched him in the chest with a fist like a cannonball. Grogmaw staggered. Something cracked in his ribs. He roared. He charged again. His cleaver rose, then smashed down into the joint where shoulder met neck. This time he drove it all the way through. The head slid off, hissing, the demon fire within, sputtering out with a hiss. Behind him, the Ashborn fought for their lives. Brandless ogres went toe-to-toe with the terrors. One caught a terror's arms and pulled, ripping it apart like tearing meat from bone. Another was cut down mid-scream, body crushed by twin hammers in a spray of gore. Grogmaw moved like a storm. He carved through another, and another. He bit the throat from one and used its spine like a flail. He fought with pain, with memory, with purpose. But then there was silence. 8 forged terrors, all dead. The floor slick with blood and oil. The crucible still glowed, casting light across the wreckage. Grogmaw limped forward. He stood before the molten basin, watched the souls writhe within. He looked at Grog, still alive, still laughing. "Break it," the machine ogre croaked. "End it." Grogmaw raised his cleaver, paused, then handed it to Brosh. He took 3 steps back. and charged the crucible himself. He hit it like a boulder hurled by gods. The stone cracked. He slammed into it again, and again. Again. It began to split. The molten brass screamed. The room shuddered. Chains snapped. Grohl howled. And with one last roar, Grogmaw drove his fist into the heart of the crucible, and it exploded. Brass, flame, light. Screams, daemons, shattered runes. The world became fire. When the smoke cleared, the crucible was gone. The chamber collapsed inward. Grogmaw rose from the rubble, half his body burned, one arm limp, skin hanging in strips from his back. But he stood. He always stood. Behind him, the survivors, Ashborn and Brandless alike, looked upon the wreckage, upon what had been done, and knew the forges of their enslavement were dead. Blood in his teeth, cleaver still smoldering. He said 3 words. "We march now," and they followed. Chapter 10. The Black Ambassador. The ash-strewn path to the gates of Zarduon was painted with silence. The Ashborn marched, slow, wide, breathing smoke. Their shadows stretched long across the broken plain, trailing the remnants of the binding crucible like echoes of violence and heat. Some limped, some bled, some muttered prayers to no god at all. But all of them followed. At their head, Grogmaw walked with one eye swollen shut, skin split across his arms like dried leather. His gut plate was cracked down the center. The rune for endure still pulsed faintly with dull orange light. His cleaver dragged behind him, a crooked scar in the dust. And rising before them now, Zarduon, the Forge Fortress, last bastion of Chaos Dwarf might. In the east, a monument of cruelty. Its walls were tiered like a ziggurat carved by hatred, fortified with obsidian and demon stone, its parapets crowned with screaming skull braziers. Huge war cannons loomed from their slits, each barrel rimmed with runes that bled fire when spoken aloud. Above it all, smoke towers belched soot into the sky, darkening the noonday sun. At the gate, he waited. Not a soldier, not a war engine, but a diplomat of death. Drajul the Black, known in whispers as the Ambassador of Chains. He stood draped in black silk robes lined with veins of stitched flesh. His beard was bound with bone rings, each carved from the teeth of a slain giant. His hands were bare, long fingers ending in golden nails. Upon his brow sat a circlet of rusted iron etched with glyphs that moved when not watched. He did not raise a weapon. He raised a hand, and the Ashborn stopped. Even the Brandless felt it, a pressure in the skull, a gentle push behind the eyes that said, "Stop, listen, submit." The wind carried Drajul's voice as if it were whispered from inside each skull. "Grogmaw," he said, "breaker of the pit, butcher of the crucible, devourer of chains." Grogmaw said nothing. Drajul smiled without warmth. "You've made your point, quite thoroughly. Zargran burns, the crucible is ash, the forge lines are shattered, the overseers dead." He stepped forward, just beyond the threshold of the gate. "I come with terms." The Ashborn hissed. Brosh spat a glob of blackened phlegm onto the stone. Urg muttered to his pike banner, but Grogmaw raised a hand, and silence held. Drussel continued, "Zarduon is mighty. Our war machines line the walls. Our sorcerers can melt the marrow from your bones before you reach the 3rd tier, but it would cost us greatly. We are not eager to lose more assets." He gestured outward, "As to you, and to your new nation." The word burned like a poisoned kiss. "A place in the east, for ogres to rule, to eat, to breed, to be left alone. He smiled. Not free, of course, but unbound. We give you land, you give us tribute. Warriors, flesh, trade. His voice lowered. It is the best you will ever be offered. Grogmaw stepped forward. He could smell the incense, the oil, the rot beneath the diplomat's robes. Say it again. Grogmaw tilted his head. You want the terms repeated? Well, Grogmaw's voice dropped. Say it again. What you called us? Russell blinked. I said. Grogmaw moved. His cleaver was a blur. The first stroke took Drazul's left arm, shoulder to elbow, gone in a single arc. The second carved a gash through the ambassador's stomach, spilling black fluid and half-formed organs. The third shattered the circlet from his brow and cleaved into his skull. Drazul dropped. Still alive. Belly. His mouth moved, lips slick with blood. You fool. Grogmaw bent down, grabbed the Chaos Dwarf by the beard, and whispered, We are not assets, we are wrath-given legs. Then he ripped the beard free, tearing scalp and flesh with it, and threw the body at the gates. The Ashborn roared. The Brandless pounded fists at chests, and Grogmaw stood before the doors of Zarduin, blood painting his teeth, cleaver steaming in the wind. He pointed to the walls. No more chains. He pointed to the mountain. No more gods. Then to the fortress. No more peace. From within Zarduin the alarms began to ring. Brass bells. Wharf sirens. Furnace calls. The war engines turned toward the plain. The battle was coming. The final march. But first, Grogmaw turned to his kin, and with fire behind him and ruin ahead, he said, Sharpen your cleavers. We end it tomorrow. Chapter 11. The March of Chains. The sun did not rise on the day they marched. Not fully. It hung in the sky like a blood clot behind the veil of smoke, its light dulled and sickly, smeared across the heavens like a wound that refused to heal. The earth trembled under the weight of what approached. Not a storm, not a tide, but vengeance, slow and unrelenting. Grogmaw stood at the head of the host. His cleaver gleamed dully in the haze, pitted and blackened from a dozen forge fires, but sharp enough to cleave stone from bone. The runes on his gut plate glowed faintly now. Endure, freedom, and the oldest one, carved in blood and iron. Maulus. Behind him stretched the Ashborn. Not a legion, a mob, but one with purpose. Ogres of all kinds, scarred, branded, warped. Some wore armor made from war machine plating, others bare-chested with rune-burned flesh. Some had no eyes, some had no tongues, but all of them carried weapons, and none of them wore chains. The Brandless walked with them, mad, limping, but driven by something more feral than faith. Some beat drums made of overseer skins, others dragged sledges piled with bones, and others still carved runes into their own flesh with each step, offering pain as oath. Grogmaw raised a fist. The host halted. Before them rose Zarduin, final bastion of the Chaos Dwarfs. It stood like a mountain carved into hate, tiered like a ziggurat of suffering. Its walls shone with obsidian and brass. At the parapets, fire glaives glinted. Black-armored dwarfs scurried like insects, manning warp cannons that hissed and steamed, their barrels pointed down like the judgment of 1,000 gods. The gates were shut, fortified with demon steel, guarded by infernal castellans, immense Chaos Dwarfs encased in armor so thick it fused to their skin. Their axes were the size of doors, and their eyes glowed with sorcerous spite. And between the ogres and the walls, a killing field, boiling trenches, lava canals, spike pits and rotating rune glyphs that sizzled the flesh from birds who dared fly too low. It was a fortress built to butcher, not to defend. Brosh stepped to Grogmaw's side, his brass-grown arm twitching. "They know we're coming," he said, voice low. Grogmaw stared forward, unmoving. "I want them to." From the walls, horns blew. Warflame cannons ignited with a shriek, and the first volley came screaming down. It landed in the front ranks. The ground erupted. Limbs spun through the air. The first line of Ashborn vanished in a blossom of green fire and blood. One ogre ran, screaming, arms aflame, before collapsing in a heap of smoke and bone. The second volley came faster, and then came the march. Not a charge, not a sprint. Just forward, relentless. The ogres trudged through the flames. Some died screaming. Others used corpses as shields. When the fireglaves fired, they returned with boulders, with broken war machine parts, hurled with the strength of mountains. Gunners were torn from walls. Towers cracked. Brosh lifted a fallen cannon and used it as a ram, swinging it like a club to flatten a rune cease that had surged from the lava trench. Urk drove a rusted spear through the throat of a Chaos Dwarf captain, then head-butted another until his skull split. Grogmaw smashed through a rune glyph trap, cleaver cleaving through the mechanism with sparks and cursed screams. He moved like a battering ram forged from rage and memory, cutting a path wide enough for 20 to follow. Then came the war engines. From Zardur's upper levels, the dwarves unleashed their abominations. Siege behemoths, part golem, part demon, part tank, towering metal horrors belching flame from their mouths, claws dragging trenches into the stone. Their eyes burned with binding runes, their bodies hummed with soul engines. One came for Grogmaw directly. Its mouth opened, a furnace of shrieking steel, and unleashed a blast of raw warp fire. Grogmaw vanished. For a moment, the Ashborn cried out. Then the smoke cleared, and he stood, jaw blackened, but breathing. He hurled his cleaver. It embedded into the engine's rune core, splitting the symbol of binding. The demon screamed, and the behemoth exploded, killing 30 dwarves in a gout of warp fire. The host roared, and they surged forward. The outer wall fell beneath their fists. The inner gate cracked under a siege beast the Brandless had reanimated from corpses and gears. Ashborn cleavers bit through cursed steel. Brandless ogres climbed the walls like spiders, dragging defenders off the parapets to be devoured alive. The dwarfs tried to rally, tried to pray. It didn't matter. This wasn't war. This was judgment. And it wore a cleaver and a cracked gutplate. By nightfall, the second wall had collapsed. By dawn, the outer city burned. And at the gates of the central ziggurat, Grogmaw raised his blade high, blood-soaked, smoke-covered, and he bellowed a word not spoken since the age of tyrants. The ogres charged. The march had ended. The slaughter had just begun. Chapter 12. The Pyre of Kings. They breached the ziggurat at dusk. The last light of the sun bled red across the black walls of Jarduan, casting molten shadows over the battlefield. The outer city was gone, nothing left but fire and torn metal, the corpses of Chaos Dwarfs and ogres tangled like roots in a forest of bone. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of blood cooked on brass. Grogmaw stood at the threshold of the inner sanctum. His cleaver, chipped and blackened, dragged a long groove through the obsidian floor. His body was covered in wounds, cuts down to the bone, burns that peeled flesh. One arm hung limp, the shoulder shattered from the strike of a siege axe. But he walked, always forward, always up. The surviving Ashborn moved behind him like a tide of rune. Brosh limped beside him, The warp metal of his infected arm now fused with bone, pulsing with a sickly yellow light. Irk still carried the pike of banners, though it now flew in flames. The Brandless had grown quiet, their mutterings replaced by breathless anticipation. Each step echoed through the corridor of the dead. They entered the Hall of Kings. It was vast, a cathedral of conquest, 40 feet tall, 100 wide, lit by furnace light and rune torches that flickered with demonic flame. Pillars lined the path, each carved with the visage of a fallen Chaos Dwarf sorcerer prophet. Their eyes wept obsidian, their mouths screamed without sound. At the far end was the throne, raised on steps of black stone and skulls, and upon it sat the sorcerer king of Zardu. Not alive. He was stone now, mostly. His flesh long calcified from years of overcasting, his limbs locked in place, his lower body fused to the throne itself. His face was a rictus of fury and power, eyes glowing faintly, mouth twisted in a permanent sneer. Brass horns jutted from his brow. One hand gripped a staff fused with demonic bone. Around him stood the throned guard, the last of the infernal castellans. 10 of them, massive, ancient, their armor fused to flesh, their axes as tall as men. Each had once overseen a city, now reduced to little more than eternal servants of a master who could no longer rise from his seat. Grogmaw stepped forward, and the king spoke, not with breath, but with will. His voice slithered into their minds like rusted nails beneath the skull. "So you come," he rasped. "The monster who broke my chains, the beast who dared unmake my forge." His voice cracked like stone splitting. "You do not understand what you've undone. You've killed not just masters, but purpose, order. You were made to serve." Grogmaw's breath came in heavy grunts. He looked around. At the walls, lined with ancient runes of domination, rows of iron masks once worn by enslaved ogres, now shattered and scattered like the teeth of gods. He spoke, voice thick with smoke and pain. "No more chains." The king snarled, his eyes flared with warp light. "Then you will kneel in ash." And the throned guard charged. The hall erupted into war. The first castellan swung a hammer the size of a coffin, crushing an Ashborn skull in a spray of meat and iron. Another cleaved Irk's left leg at the knee, sending the ogre toppling in a roar of pain and rage. Grogmaw met them in the center. Steel slammed against steel. His cleaver bit into a castellan's side, sparks erupted, the blade stuck in the armor, wedged between ribs and rune plate. The castellan swung back with a gauntlet, punching Grogmaw full in the face. Bone cracked. He reeled, spat teeth. Rosh leapt from the flank, his brass arms smashing into the castellan's helmet with a shriek of metal. The skull within caved. The guard fell, twitching. Then came another, and another. The fight was slow, heavy, every blow like thunder. Blood poured in sheets, pooling beneath the steps of the throne. One Brandless ogre tackled a castellan into a pillar. Both were crushed when it collapsed. Another tore his own stomach open to spill warp fire across 3 of the enemy, laughing until his ribs glowed red hot. Grogmaw fought like a storm. He took wounds that would have felled titans, and kept moving, kept killing, until at last he stood alone before the throne, 6 castellans dead. Creeding dying, and crawling, missing half his torso. Grogmaw looked up at the king of Zardu. "Come down," he growled. The king laughed, a bitter, grinding sound. "He cannot. This throne is my soul, my strength, my sentence. I will not rise, but I will not fall." Grogmaw stepped onto the first stair. and the second. His legs trembled. His wounds poured. The king's eyes flared again. Runes across the throne lit up, screaming. Brass chains shot from the throne, snaking through the air, wrapping around Grogmaw's arms, legs, throat. They burned, they bound. He dropped to one knee. The king leaned forward, voice dripping with hate. "I will forge your corpse into a warning." Grogmaw clenched his jaw and stood back up. Chains groaned. His skin sizzled. And still, he rose. He took another step, and another, and each chain pulled tighter. One snapped, then another, until he was free and standing eye to eye with the king. He raised his cleaver. No gods, no thrones. He swung. The blade struck the staff, splitting it. The runes shattered. The throne screamed. The king screamed. And then Grogmaw drove the cleaver through the king's stone chest. Cracks spread across the throne like lightning. The floor shook. Flames burst from the walls. Demons howled in the foundation. The throne exploded, not in fire, but in dust, in centuries of decay finally undone. There was grumbling. Grogmaw was thrown back. Everything collapsed around him. When the ash settled, the Hall of Kings was gone. The throne reduced to rubble, and Grogmaw stood in the ruin, awoken, blood dripping from his fists. At his feet, the cracked crown of brass. He picked it up, looked at it, and cast it into the fire. Behind him, the Ashborn gathered, what few remained, waited for words. He gave them none. He simply turned and walked outside, where the pyres were already burning. Chapter 13. Ashcrown. Zardoon burned for 3 days. The fire spread from forge to parapet, from temple to tower, each structure collapsing under its own greed and heat. Ash fell like snow, thick and slow, coating the battlefield in a shifting shroud of gray. Smoke curled in black pillars toward the poisoned sky, blotting out the sun, turning day to dusk. And in the center of the ruined city, where the great ziggurat once stood like a god's tooth, the ogres gathered. Hundreds. Ashborn, Brandless, as feral survivors and dazed escapees from shattered pens. Some limped from rubble, coughing blood. Others dragged wounded kin or the corpses of fallen friends wrapped in scavenged banners. No songs, no horns, only breath and pain and silence. Atop the steps of the shattered throne platform, Grogmaw stood. His cleaver was gone. His gutplate dented, cracked. The rune for endure, half seared from a cannon blast that took part of his shoulder. His face was carved with fresh scars, his eyes sunken but burning. He looked out across the ruins, and in that moment something happened. The ogres, those few still standing, began to kneel, one by one, without a word, not in worship, not in fear, but in recognition. He had broken the pitch, sighted the crucible, crushed the throne. He had led them out of fire. They lowered their heads and waited. At the foot of the platform, Brosh climbed the steps, his infected arm now entirely brass, his face gaunt, eye half clogged. He carried something cradled in cloth, blackened, warped, ringed with broken horn and teeth. The crown of the Sorcerer King. It no longer shone. It pulsed with a faint heat, the echo of power. Not demonic, not divine, just weight, the kind that crushed men slowly, from the inside out. Rosh knelt, held the crown up in both hands. "You won," he said. Grogmaw stared at it, at the jagged brass, at the runes that crawled like ants across its surface. Behind him, the wind stirred. A murmur moved through the crowd. No words, just breath held, shoulders squared, muscles tight. Waiting, Grogmaw reached out. Fingers wrapped around the crown. He lifted it. The ash wind grew still, and every eye turned to the platform. His arms tensed. He looked at them, at all of them, every scar, every broken horn, every pair of eyes that had watched their world crumble, just to crawl out again. They needed something, a name, a banner, a team, and Grogmaw, he looked at the crown, turned it in his hands, and snapped it in half. The brass cracked with a sound like a dying forge. He hurled the pieces into the pyre below. Flames swallowed them, and the wind howled again, this time free. He turned to the gathered ogres. His voice was rough stone, dragged from his chest like it had been carved with teeth. No more thrones. The words struck harder than any war horn. No more kings. The ogres stared. Some wept. Others dropped their weapons. Björk fell to his knees, muttering, "We don't need a crown. We have a fire." Rosh bowed his head. "You lit it?" Grogmaw said nothing more. He stepped down from the throne, walked through the crowd. They parted for him, not because they had to, because they understood. He passed between them like a storm breaking, like a fire walking. He followed, but not too close. The Ashborn would build. They would shape something from the bones of Zardur, not an empire, a home, a Grogmaw. He was already walking away, toward the horizon, where the sky burned low and the mountains split the earth. And cleaverless Ogre, with no chains, no gods, no crown. And behind him, whispered in awe and blood and fire, they called him one name only, Ashground, not worn, but earned. Chapter 14. Beneath no banner. The wind that rolled across the black slag plains was dry and bitter. It whispered across broken stones and the melted skeletons of ruined towers. Once this had been the outland garrisons of the Chaos Dwarfs, border watch posts forged from basalt and tyranny. Now they were hollowed husks, slag-melted, blackened, empty. And through them walked Grogmaw, alone. He left the Ashborn behind, left them in the smoldering cradle of Zarduin, their forged city of freedom. They had begged him to stay, pleaded, called him war chief, sire, even hope. But Grogmaw said nothing. He simply turned east and began to walk. The cleaver he now carried was not the same. The old one had broken in the throne room's fall. This one he forged himself, alone, in the ruins of the crucible, in silence, not from brass or demonic steel, but from the melted remains of slave chains, overseer blades, and one shattered binding plate still etched with his old identification rune, Asset K13. He melted it all. He shaped it with stone. He didn't name it, because it didn't matter. He walked without food, without rest. He walked because he had to. Because still, even after thrones fell, after forges died, after gods were denied and chains turned to fire, the world whispered, "Come back to the fold." And he would not. The first time they approached, they didn't look like enemies. They looked like brothers, ogres, half a dozen, draped in scavenged armor, their faces tattooed in the style of the Stoneheart tribes from the deep Darklands. One bore a necklace of dwarfen beards. Another carried a war horn carved from a firebull's horn. They saw him from afar, recognized the bearing, the silence. They waved, called out, "Brother, you survived Zarduin. We heard the songs. We want to follow you." Grogmaw stopped. He saw it then, in their eyes. Hunger, not for food, but for leadership. for direction. They didn't want to walk their own path. They wanted his, the one he bled to burn away. They were waiting for a banner to kneel to. Even now, even after everything, Grogmaw said nothing. He turned away. One of the ogres, a brute called Murgle, didn't like that. He stepped forward, snarled. "You think you're better than us, Cleaver-born? Think silence makes you wise?" Another stepped beside him, brandishing a stone axe. "We fought, same as you, bled, same as you, but we want something to follow. You don't give it, then maybe we take it." Grogmaw stood still, then took one step forward. Another. Closer. The ogres formed a half-circle, weapons drawn. Murgle raised his axe and bellowed, "Fine, then. We'll carve your bones into the haft of our—" He didn't finish. Grogmaw moved faster than a thing that size had any right to. His cleaver struck Murgle just beneath the chin. It didn't cut. It crushed, splintered his jaw, pulped his throat, drove bone into brain. He dropped like a puppet with its strings cut. The others hesitated. Wrong move. Grogmaw turned, and he became a storm. One cleaver swing split another's face clean down the middle, teeth and tongue spilling like worms onto the black soil. The third tried to run. He caught him by the ankle and swung him into a crumbling pillar, once, twice, until the ogre's head popped like fruit. Another raised a spiked club. Grogmaw caught the swing on his shoulder, let it bite, and headbutted him so hard the skull inverted. Blood soaked the earth. By the end, one ogre remained, on his knees, sobbing. I just wanted to matter." Grogmaw stared at him, then spoke, voice low, cracked. "You do, but not like this." And he walked away. The last one alive, not out of mercy, but so he'd carry the message. No banners, no thrones, no gods, Destiny no king. That night, Grogmaw found a crag above the plain and built no fire. He sat, silent, overlooking the darkened world below. Ash on the wind, stars hidden behind smoke. He drew a rock from his belt, flat, black, cold. On it, he scratched a single rune with the edge of his cleaver. It wasn't a name. It wasn't a word. It was a choice. He placed it on the ground. He did not pray. He did not bow. He just watched the horizon and waited for the next road to show itself. Chapter 15. The Path of Smoke. The wind whispered his name, but not as it had before. Not like the slaver's hiss, not like the war chant bellowed from bloodied throats, not like the prayer of starving mouths in forge-chained barracks. This time it came like smoke curling through broken teeth. A breath, a memory, not praise, just presence. Grogmaw stood at the edge of the world. Before him stretched the eastern desolations, a land where even maps refused to speak. The last shattered spines of the World's Edge Mountains clawed at a bruise-colored sky. Valleys choked with ash and fog swirled below. Nothing living moved, just crows of unnatural size circling in silence. Behind him lay a trail of fire, chain, and silence. Zadum had crumbled into embers. The Ashborn were rebuilding in the crater of a dead empire, hammering truth from ruins, bone, and freedom. But Grogmaw walked on. He had crossed the ash wastes, survived the crucible, killed the unkillable, broken thrones, refused crowns, and still he did not stop. He passed a tree blackened by warp fire, its bark twisted into screaming mouths. A skull had been nailed to its trunk, an ogre's, old, cracked with a rune carved into its forehead, servant. Grogmaw touched it once, then crushed it with a single squeeze. He passed a dried riverbed where chaos spawn writhed in the mud, gnawing on their own limbs. One saw him. Charged, its body a tangle of arms, tusks, and iron. He met it with his cleaver. The fight lasted seconds. When it twitched its last, Grogmaw sliced open its belly and found a jawbone inside, still gold-ringed, still twitching. He left it there to rot. By the third day, the wind turned colder. On the fourth, he came upon a shrine, broken, sunken, its stones marked with both dwarfen and ogre glyphs. A dead dwarf was pinned to it with a spear through the chest, arms outstretched. Around him, nobblers had scrawled crude prayers in dried blood. They walked here. Grogmaw not king, Grogmaw fire. Freedom hurts, but tastes good. He stared at it a while, then sat down. A noblar peeked from the rocks behind him, half-starved, covered in soot. It blinked again, then crept forward and placed a small offering at his feet. A musk made of cracked bone, not to wear, to carry. Grogmaw took it, said nothing. The noblar scurried off. That night, he climbed the last ridge before the mists, and waited. The stars came out slowly, sharp points of white over a sky black with cinders. The clouds below shifted, curling and uncoiling like a great serpent in slumber. Lightning flashed now and then in the east, far off, cold. He stood there for hours. No fire, no food, only thought. He pulled his gut plate off for the first time in weeks, laid it before him. Etched into it were all the runes he had carved across his journey. In Brandless, Ashborn, no gods, no kings. Free. He reached into the pouch at his hip, drew a nail. Rusted, pulled from the wall of the crucible, and carved one final word beneath all the others. A single line, 2 slashes, 1 circle. Walk. Not for vengeance, not for followers, not even for memory. He'd just the road, because the road never ends. And monsters don't rest. They simply choose which direction to bleed. He rose, lifted his cleaver, turned to the east, and walked into the smoke. Behind him, a legend grew. Some said he became a god. Some said he died beneath the mountains, swallowed by something older than chaos. Others said he never truly lived at all, that Grogmaw was just a name given to the thing that broke the chains. But in every dark place where the forge still burns, where overseers lift their whips, where the brand is heated and the shackle awaits, there is a whisper, a breath, not a war cry, not a prayer, just a warning. He's still walking,